These days, because of the globalization and everything else, investor in Hong Kong or in Singapore, in Europe, or in the States, they're all quite similar, as a matter of fact. One can't tell the difference anyway. And one thing I notice is more and more of these investors are focusing more on corporate governance. Say, for example, we started to put in a chapter on corporate governance in our annual report even 2 years ago. Now is something we need to comply, but we started that 2 years ago in Unicom. And in a roadshow, investor does put it up from time to time and say, hey, we noticed that you have done this and done that. We think this is good, and this, you should do more, for example. And as I mentioned, some bigger funds have actually set up corporate governance evaluation unit within an investment fund. And if they want to invest a large sum of money into a public listed company, they need that particular committee to vet this particular investment. So if they think this particular firm doesn't have a good track record of good corporate governance or enough good internal control, they will be able to invest in that firm as well. So I think what I've noticed over the last 2 years is a lot more investors putting more and more emphasis on corporate governance, and that is not just in US, also in Hong Kong and in this part of the world as well.
Things, it seems, are changing in Hong Kong, and investors are beginning to exert pressure on management to raise corporate governance standards. But it is often said that the main driver behind corporate governance reform in Hong Kong is the government and regulators. We asked our guests for their views on whether corporate governance reform in Hong Kong is driven by regulators and how effective is this top-down approach.
I think it is pushed by requirements. I have to be honest and say if the exchange had not introduced more and more corporate governance requirements, by far and away the majority of companies would not have complied or would not have introduced the standards that they have now, especially given, I'll say, the lack of institutional pressure. It may have come about in the UK, but I think it does need to be pushed by regulators. The fine line is in regulators providing a framework within which the companies can operate without becoming overly prescriptive, and it's a difficult line to find.
Up until probably a year, 12 months ago, I would say, or probably 2 years ago, I would say governance was very much driven by the regulator, not just in Hong Kong, but in almost every market. But what we've noticed in the past 2 years at least, if not perhaps 2 to 3 years, is that on one hand, companies are now starting to respond to competitive pressures for better corporate governance. So pressures from investors, pressures from creditors, pressures from the international market generally. So that's something that's another push factor that is encouraging companies to see governance as something that's in their own interest. At the same time, we're also seeing investors, some retail investors and some large institutional investors getting much more involved in expressing their views on governance issues. And one example in Hong Kong that's actually, I think, been very positive is in the last 18 months, investors have been voting against the general mandate that companies put to their shareholders at each AGM to allow them to issue shares non-preemptively and through private placement and at a discount, up to 20% of issued capital and up to a 20% discount. Hong Kong standards in this area are well behind those in the UK and sort of the international norm. Shareholders, particularly big investors, have been voting against those in large numbers. And the good thing is companies are listening. You're now seeing companies voluntarily reducing their mandates. CLP has, Bank of China Hong Kong has, Swire Pacific has, and Hong Kong Stock Exchange didn't seek a mandate this year. So it's good to see that market practices are actually moving in a positive direction and without necessarily the rules having to be changed. So I would say that in the last 12 months or so that there is in certain areas a positive shift where market discipline is actually having an effect on corporate behaviour, and I think that's great. That's what we want to see.
The government does have a very clear interest in promoting good corporate governance, but I believe that good corporate governance starts in the boardroom with the directors, not with the government. The government should play a coordinating and facilitating role, and of course, if necessary, where things go wrong, then the government and the regulators do need to step in, but the objective is to ensure that these corporate abuses do not occur in the first place, which brings us back to this whole issue of standards in the boardroom and corporate culture. I think there's a distinction between corporate governance and corporate regulation, although the two are very frequently confused in practice. If I could go back to the words of Sir Adrian Cadbury in the Cadbury report, he defined corporate governance as the system by which companies are directed and controlled. Corporate governance is internal. It stems from within the company. It is the primary responsibility, as I said, of the directors. And a lot of good corporate governance can really be characterized as best practice. In other words, it cannot be really specified in the forms of laws or regulations. On the other hand, corporate regulation is something which is imposed from outside and sets, basically the regulators are responsible for policing a regulatory and legal framework within which companies operate, and if they go beyond the limits of that of what is prescribed by the law, then they should be penalised accordingly. As such, it's really as opposed from coming from within, these are standards which are enforced from outside, and so the two things are very different. I mean, I as a regulator am primarily responsible for enforcing the provisions of the Companies Ordinance. There are other regulators like the SFC and HKX which are responsible for enforcing the provisions of the Securities and Futures Ordinance and the Hong Kong listing rules. We all have our own different regulatory regimes to enforce, so I think given this it's really quite impossible for us to impose a particular model for all companies to follow, and indeed this would be quite inappropriate because, as I said earlier on, the primary responsibility for good corporate governance should come from the companies themselves, in particular the directors of the company.
When 2 years ago there was discussion of whether the SFC should be a frontline regulator of listed companies, and then subsequently, as we all know, that was changed, that the kind of the split role of regulation between the various bodies was maintained. The exchange remained the frontline regulator. I think there is a question mark as to whether there is within the highest levels of government a willingness to certainly challenge established practices that would lead to, I mean, a real step difference in the way companies are governed. I think it does come back to this point that Hong Kong companies are not shy of capital, and hence there isn't the external pressure for a reform. So we're doing all right. I mean, there is the question of, well, if you're not short of capital in this economy, why change? So I mean, I think without, from my read on government, I'll be very interested to see with the new administration under Donald Jiang, I mean, what type of priorities are laid